Hey everyone, welcome in this Azure Back to School video. My name is Peter D. Tender. I'm an Azure technical trainer at Microsoft, and I'm going to help you understanding how Azure DevOps and GitHub, the Prime 2 DevOps tool that everybody's talking about, can nicely integrate with each other, and maybe how you can migrate from one to the other as well. If you got any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm quite active on Twitter, PDTIT. Follow my technical blog, aka.ms/PDTIT. And if you got any questions, that would be petender@microsoft.com if you want to send me an email. Before moving on and jumping into the technical part of the video, let me thank Dwayne and Derek for having me for the third year in a row participating in this awesome Azure Back to School series. Cool. What are we going to do in the next hour? I'm going to walk you through the rumor, you could say, that's been around for a couple of years, that Azure DevOps is a dead-end product. Now, I'm going to try and convince you that, first of all, it's not at all that. But on the other side, I think we need to be honest, and GitHub is gaining traction. Does it mean that Azure DevOps is going away and like getting overruled, replaced with GitHub? Maybe at some point in time. I have no idea about it. And honestly, I actually hope that it's not going to be the case, but that's just my personal preference. And that's why I want to talk about this session, showing you how the two worlds can nicely work together. Now, if you're wondering, like maybe at some point I'm going to step away from DevOps, I'm also going to walk you through some experiences out of my technical background, how you can start your migration from Azure DevOps into GitHub. A little bit about myself. So as you already know, Peter, Azure technical trainer. So it's probably one of the easiest job roles in Microsoft. What we do is providing Azure technical training to our top customers and partners from all over the world. Although I lived in Belgium for about 46 years, I recently, beginning this year, the first week of January, actually moved to the Redmond area and currently presenting and living there. My technical background started about 26 years ago in Windows NT4 Server was my first server technology in my career, and then gradually moving up to the awesome world called Azure, where I started with about 10 years ago. I was an Azure MVP for 5 years, a Microsoft certified trainer for a bit more than 12 years now, and in the little bit of free time that I have, also published a couple of books, and you can see a few examples over there. So again, feel free to reach out, ask questions, ask me anything you want to find out about DevOps, Azure DevOps, GitHub, GitHub Actions, or anything that's Azure related, you could say. Let's dive into the technical part of the session. So the first thing, Azure DevOps is not dead. And I'm quite certain about it. Why is Azure DevOps not dead? It's a question that I get every single week in every Azure 400 Microsoft DevOps Solutions training I'm providing. Like, we open class at 9 o'clock, and then by 9:15, when everybody's like joined into the calls, because it's all virtual nowadays, there's always, at least one attendee asking like, what are we going to do in the next 4 days? Because Azure DevOps seems like outdated. Nobody's talking about Azure DevOps anymore. And this is literally what I tell them. First of all, Azure DevOps is not at all dead. Although you might think that GitHub is like the next big thing, and I'm pretty sure that, GitHub is awesome. There's no way around it. But it's not exactly the same as Azure DevOps. A lot of features that I'm going to walk you through later on, it's all about integration. It's not about replacing one product with the other. So why is Azure DevOps not dead? Microsoft officially confirmed, that's definitely important, officially confirmed that Azure DevOps will not get what they call getting sunsetted or deprecated or replacing GitHub with Azure DevOps at all, or the other way around. So none of that is true if you picked up any of those rumors. Next to that, there is a continuous update in Azure DevOps. Every month, literally, there's new features coming out. And if you go to that website, I'll squeeze that in a demo in the next couple of minutes. There's a Azure DevOps feature timeline where you can go back all the way to like 2017 or so when they launched the product initially, and still showing you what's on the roadmap. And I can tell you that the roadmap is actually quite extensive. There's, for now, about 25 features that they published for the short-term roadmap, so anything within the next 2 to 3 months. You could say the next quarter in Microsoft terms, where there's updates around security, changes in the personal access tokens, how they're going to work and how you can use them. heavily expanding the functionality of Azure Boards that I'll talk about a little bit later on, and obviously also expanding on the GitHub integration. So hopefully, as you can see by now, it's not at all. So let's have a look about the Azure DevOps feature timeline. So again, there's an extensive documentation available here on the website. So you go to docs.microsoft.com, you go to the Azure DevOps main landing page, and from there you find the features timeline. As mentioned, it allows you to go all the way back in history, where there's a split up between Azure DevOps Services, the cloud option, as well as Azure DevOps Server, if you are running your DevOps server in your own on-prem environment. For each and every month, as you can see over the last year, and the same for 2021, the same for 2019, it shows you all the updates. So obviously it's not that important to know what happened in the past because those are features that you already use, but it's more interesting to know what's happening in the near and longer term future. So that's what you can find over here. I mentioned about 25 changes on the roadmap, and honestly I think it's actually more, but just made it a little easy number. So what's coming up in this quarter? The quarter is typically the calendar year. It's slightly different in Microsoft terms because our fiscal starts in July, and this is reflecting the actual calendar year. So for example, as I mentioned, updates around path scoping. There's another one down here that's a little bit further out, so not within the next 5 to 6 months, but at least having another security update around integrations of the personal access tokens into the audit logging to also know what your application service accounts are doing and not just the interactive DevOps admin user accounts. The deprecation of Server 2016 and macOS 10.14 outdated image, I think that's actually already published as well. If you run a pipeline that has 2016 as a build server or macOS 10.14, it's already telling you that you cannot run that anymore. And then in the next coming 2 to 3 months, that's what you find over here, 2022 Q4, improving GitHub connection experience. I think this is a quite promising one. And then here on the side, you can see like what are the main target objectives. And as you can see here, it's mainly pipelines and boards, besides maybe some overall Azure DevOps functionalities, but it's primarily boards that's still getting updated and pipelines as well, allowing you to continue using it as one of the nicer tools, I would say. All that yet. Next to that, it's also about strengthening the integration. But before we can talk about integration, it's also about what makes Azure DevOps so awesome today. Azure DevOps has a whole bunch of features. There's Azure Boards, that's the project management. Azure Pipelines, obviously the CI/CD. Azure Artifacts is where you're going to store your NuGet packages, NPM packages for Node, Maven packages, Docker containers if you want. Azure Test Plans or overall Azure Tests is the integration, functional testing, user testing that you could also integrate out of Visual Studio. And another interesting feature is Azure Wikis, like a wiki environment built integrated into Azure DevOps, allowing you to document your scenarios. Now, if you map these core 5-6 functionalities with GitHub, it's not exactly the same. So for example, the dashboards, one of the nicer things, is available in GitHub, but not really as extensive as it exists today in Azure DevOps. The Azure Boards, the project management feature, yes, there is GitHub projects, GitHub issues as well. Those two are slightly moving into what Azure Boards could do, but it's not exactly the same mindset. Azure Boards give you that full Kanban integration or Kanban boards integration, starting from work items like individual to-do tasks, but also reporting, bugs you're working on, issues you need to fix. So again, I would say for now it's slightly more extensive than what GitHub projects and issues can give you today. Azure Pipelines is a big one. Again, it's the CI/CD. It's probably what most of you, if you are already familiar with Azure DevOps, know about. Now, Azure Pipelines gives you a classic interface, so a little bit what I describe as the Microsoft drag and drop scenario, but also YAML integration, where later on in some demos, I'll show you how you can migrate from classic pipelines into YAML pipelines. and then maybe later on moving to GitHub YAML-based pipelines. Where GitHub today, GitHub Actions actually, the workflows within are only understanding YAML. So the biggest challenge there is the learning curve. I think it's quite challenging to just step into YAML without knowing a little bit more about the platform itself. And then artifacts packages are quite similar in feature, in capability, so nothing really there. Azure test plans, as far as I know, there's no real alternative in GitHub today besides running some testing workflows out of GitHub Actions, but lacking a little bit on the monitoring side, a little bit on the dashboarding side. Cool. Now, why is this important? First of all, it's not about the tooling. If you understand the core about DevOps, it's not at all about the tooling. Why not? Because there's so many different tools doing about the same thing, and you need to focus on what works for your environment, right? So I would say, in short, try to avoid the discussion with your internal teams or maybe with customers, depending in what scenario you're using Azure DevOps, that one solution would be better than any other solution. There's a lot of awesome DevOps products out there. You might know about GitLab, you might know about Octopus Deploy, Jenkins, Jira, so many different tools, and they are all awesome. So what it's about, it's how it works for your DevOps culture. You got so many different teams. I know, yes, DevOps is about the developers and operations nicely working together, but honestly, it's a lot more than just those two DevOps teams or DevOps team members, right? There's project management, there's business stakeholders, there's maybe partnerships with other companies, and so on and so on. So try to find a tool or maybe a collection of tools that works for you. And I would say cultivate that culture of DevOps. Or next to that, it's reusing, again, what works for your scenario. Emphasize the strengths of each solution, whether it's a native Azure integration, whether it's a multi-platform integration, and also look into third-party tools, where even out of Azure DevOps, there's an extensive marketplace where specifically for monitoring, there's like 60 extensions you can install. For security, I know there's more than 100 you could choose from, like integrating source code security, vulnerability scanning, where yes, I know in GitHub it's already integrated, but moving back to the DevOps culture, it's about we need to integrate SecDevOps, or we need to move security into our model. We need to integrate better monitoring. We need to allow our business to migrate towards site resiliency engineering. Why not? And that's all possible with any of the tools. So again, it's not about Azure DevOps being better than another, or worst case, the rumor Azure DevOps being dead, and it's about time you're going to replace it with something else. Not at all the case. Now, I talked about DevOps quite a bit, but what's important if you don't know, what is DevOps actually about? So first of all, it's about that culture. There's an interesting definition from our former Mr. DevOps, as I like to call him, Donovan Brown, where he explained DevOps as the union of people, processes, and products to enable continuous value to your business. Now, what does it mean? It means that you're going to start with a planning phase. You're going to talk to the business. You're going to brainstorm with them. What are we going to do? We're going to build an HR application. We're going to run a marketing update. We're going to build a website. We're going to build a core business application. That's happening in the planning phase. Where do we going to run it? Is it running on-prem? Is it running at a partner? Is it running in Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, anywhere else on the planet? That's what you do in the planning phase. From the planning phase, you're going to move to the build phase. In the build phase, your ops team writes infrastructure as code templates, allowing them to automate the deployments towards target environments. And obviously, the dev part of the DevOps team will focus on building that application. Once you have the build phase complete, like we're going to integrate testing, we're going to integrate functional testing, we're going to deploy it, right? Deploying means moving it into a running state. This could be a dev and test environment, could be staging, could be production, could also be blue-green, could be canary early adopter scenarios. So whenever you pick up your package and you're going to move it into a running state, that's what we define as deploying in the DevOps mindset. And obviously, once it is running, we're going to shift to the operational part, like the monitoring, validating high availability, maybe again integrating the site resiliency engineering. And that's actually possible out of that continuous motion, because that's the other thing. DevOps is a continuous motion. Once you start doing DevOps, you are not leaving DevOps. That's the main thing. So you're going to repeat that cycle over and over, because if there's something's changing in your environment, like you got more customers, you got more users connecting to the workload, it might have impact on the performance. You might need to look into high availability optimization, where you need to go back to the planning phase, you need to go back to the build phase, you go back to deploy, and so on and so on. That's in short what DevOps is about. Now, mapping this with, again, the two tools that I'm focusing on, Azure DevOps and GitHub, you're going to see that they're quite complementary. In the planning phase, again, you could use Azure Boards, the project management component of Azure DevOps. But you also have GitHub issues, GitHub discussions, and GitHub projects. Once you're in the build phase, obviously, you start with your development environment. I have Visual Studio Code on here, but in the end, it's not about the tool, it's about your development environment. If you're using IntelliJ, if you're using any other development environment, that's still fine. The DevOps concept is not changing. It's just the tooling you're going to use. Why Visual Studio VS Code? Because they have a nice integration for GitHub and Azure DevOps from a source code, source control perspective. Then obviously Azure DevOps build pipelines, Azure repos, like the Git compatible source control environment. And on the GitHub side, we have GitHub code spaces, like a browser-based online 24/7 available development environment, which means that you don't have to install Visual Studio or VS Code anymore. You could run it from a browser. Obviously, GitHub repositories as well, like the source control part of GitHub environment. And if you're looking into optimizing security, you could integrate Dependabot on the security side in GitHub repos. It's available for free for public repos. You need to pay for it out of your GitHub Enterprise licenses. And when you want to integrate security in Azure DevOps, the ones who don't know, they go like, oh, Azure DevOps cannot provide any security integration. But that's where I need to tell you that, yes, it is possible out of the marketplace, where you can select any from the, I think latest was 104 different partners we're working with. Some extensions are available from Microsoft, some other ones are coming from third-party vendors, but it's definitely there. Moving on to the deploy phase, like really releasing something, right? That's again out of Visual Studio, right-click publish. Maybe some of you are familiar with that, but that's not really DevOps. So we're back into Azure DevOps pipelines, the release pipelines for now. Still GitHub code spaces, allowing you to integrate with GitHub Actions, workflows, and the security code scanning, why not, could also happening in the release part, where another tool that we have integrated in GitHub is CodeQL. That's like the technical security engine running the vulnerability testing. And then finally, when we're deploying Azure pipelines, GitHub Actions for build and release, if you want to split it up, Azure Artifacts integrating GitHub packages, and Azure test plans. And then finally, Azure Boards for the dashboarding, GitHub issues, GitHub discussions, GitHub projects for the monitoring the operational part if you want. And from the platform, like once it is actually running, you have Azure Monitor if you're running resources in Azure. You have the same on the AWS side, the same CloudWatch, I think they call it. And why not watching over release gates, integrating approvals before something can be deployed. Those are like some of the characteristics. Cool. That was the first part, like how can we optimize DevOps, a little bit on what DevOps is about, and mapping the functionality from the two platforms I'm focusing on in this session and how they can complement each other. Well, now the next part is obviously how can we integrate the two worlds with each other, or if you're considering migrating, what would be the best practice? So first of all, you don't have to migrate. I think that should be clear, and hopefully my demos will make that a little bit clear as well. But I'm focusing on that integration, grabbing all the cool stuff, all the best things from Azure DevOps, and taking all the best things from GitHub, where again, the ones that map with your specific scenario. It might be that for some organizations, Azure DevOps is the way to go for the next coming years. As we all know, for some organizations, they totally skip Azure DevOps and they go for GitHub for the full 100%. Is it wrong? Not at all. Again, what works for your scenario, that's the scenario you got to go for. But back to the integration. So one example, if you have GitHub repositories, you could easily, I think, move your repos into GitHub repos. It's Git-based, it's Git compatible, and I'll show you in some demos later on where you can easily integrate and migrate from one environment to the other. On the other side, I would say for now, keep your project management in Azure boards. I think it's still a lot better, having a lot more features than what GitHub is giving you today. And then regarding the pipelines, migrating, first of all, if you have Azure DevOps classic pipelines, I think it's about the right time now to become familiar with YAML syntax. I'll show you in some demos that it is actually quite doable. For each and every classic task, like the graphical user interface, there is already a snippet of code available showing you how you can move that into YAML syntax. And again, I would recommend you to start migrating your classic pipelines into YAML today. Taking it one step further, maybe migrating your classic pipelines not into YAML pipelines in Azure DevOps, but why not moving them into GitHub Actions? But there's no real migration tool to help you with that. So it's a little bit starting over. And by the way, although YAML in Azure DevOps is YAML in GitHub Actions, it's not exactly the same YAML. Got a few slides on that later on. And then regarding the artifacts, you could integrate Azure DevOps artifacts into GitHub packages, like one of the newer features they released a few months ago. But let's focus on some of these workload scenarios out of the integration, out of the migration, where the first one I would like to show you is integrating Azure boards. So the idea is really focusing on the integration. We have Azure boards on one end, but we have GitHub repositories on the other end. We're going to use GitHub repositories for storing source control, maybe integrating the security, code scanning out of Dependabot, out of CodeQL in GitHub, but we keep Azure boards for the Kanban boards, the overall work items, the project management. So what is the solution? You have a marketplace in GitHub. You deploy Azure Boards integration feature out of GitHub, and from there, they can nicely work together. I know I can talk about it, but let's switch to another demo showing you how my Azure Boards can nicely integrate with GitHub and the other way around. So in this demo, I'm going to show you the integration between Azure Boards, the project management component, and the repository updates out of GitHub. So Azure DevOps Boards is what I'm showing you right now. It's my project management Kanban dashboard, and I can start creating new work items. Depending on the project type you define in Azure DevOps, like a Scrum methodology or Agile or custom or anything in between, it's going to allow you to create specific DevOps work items. You can create bugs, epics, features, integrating pull requests, individual tasks, and moving them into a sprint, for example. Where the sprint is typically, I would say in most organizations, it would be about 3 weeks, but don't focus too much on the 3 weeks, because what you can do here is defining your own sprint timelines. So you can go back and defining your individual scenarios for each and every work item type. And on top here, you're going to define the iteration. Where again, in my case, I try to focus around every 3 weeks, but in some organizations could be longer, could be shorter, like a sprint every day, every week, every month. That's literally up to you. If you have specific work items that you cannot close within a specific sprint, so let's say over here, I got my sprint coming up in the next coming weeks. And if I don't have my sprint or I cannot close my work items within the sprint, that's where they get moved to a backlog. But the core concept remains the same. You have the tasks. When a task is not completed, you're not moving the task around. You're just going to move it to a backlog. Now, interesting to know is that within each and every work item, if there is an integration between your source control, you want to keep track of that, right? And then later on in releases, you could actually reuse that intelligence to maybe allow a deployment to go through or maybe blocking a deployment. So what you can see here out of the box is that integration, adding a link to a GitHub commit or pull request, and also defining other relationships between different work items. If you click on the link, commit, or pull request, you can provide that link, and over here you go into your DevOps environment, you go into a specific branch or maybe a pull request. Let's grab the link to the pull request, opening it up here, and I'm gonna copy, I switch back, I'm gonna paste it in here, and it's gonna tell me like, oh, that URL is not valid. Interesting, because I just copied it, right? Now the good news is you don't have to do it in this way. It would be a little bit too manual as well. So what's the solution? You go into your GitHub project. You define your GitHub repo, that's what I have over here, and you go into the marketplace. Inside the marketplace, you search for Azure Boards. You select Azure Boards as an app, and you can choose the free edition over here or the free edition over here. It doesn't matter. It's exactly the same thing. So what it allows you to do is tracking work items, searches, queries, integrating with all the cool stuff from Azure Boards, and integrating for your DevOps project, no matter how many users, for at least public repos. And there is a license fee attached to it for the non-free public repos. But once you install it, that's what I did, set up the plan, next, finish, and done. That's where the magic starts. Because what does it give me? Each and every work item in Azure DevOps has a unique number. As you can see over here, Peter needs more coffee, definitely need more coffee. It's work item 1946. If I drill down on the different boards I have, you can see I got 1858, 1930, I got a bug over here, 1859, and so on and so on. That's quite important. If you have that work item number, you can now trigger something in your GitHub repositories. So let me take one step back, go to my repository where I was using a Tailwind Traders. By the way, this is a public available repository that you can reuse if you want to go through some testing. And where's a little piece of magic? If I make a change in my code, let's say I go into my source code, I'm going to edit it from here, but it works the same with VS Code, Visual Studio, or any other development environment. We're going to trigger a change, which means there is a commit following. So let's add an update to the source code. There we go. And saving my changes. What I need to do here, just like any traditional commit, is providing a quick update. What did I change? Added a title for the demo. And adding some description, added a title. Cool. I could now commit the change and it's going to be listed as a change. There's a commit action happening. But where is that integration? So remember, we had Azure Boards, AB. We point to the number of the work item, hashtag 1913, for example, and committing my change. Looks like it shaved. It's in here, nice. And switching back, and you can see in work item 1913, it's going to show me what we call an GitHub deep link. So I don't need to juggle around copy pasting URLs where eventually it tells you like, oh, that URL is not valid. And it's immediately keeping track of the final changes. From here, I can click back on that link and it's immediately bringing me back. As you can see here, this is a pull request. How does that work? You go into the code, you make a change. So let's go back to my demo file, editing it again, gonna make another change. Another change with a pull request, there we go. The pull request is getting triggered because now I'm gonna store it into a new branch. You could give that branch whatever name you want, and I'm gonna add this over here. Oh, let's do nothing. Now I don't have that AB hashtag in my commit message, right? But I do have a new pull request. I can go in my pull request, where now I can add that comment into here. So either option works fine. You can link it to the commit message, and it already closes my pull request, or I can go back, change the branch, and now forcing that actual pull request. No idea why I needed to re-authenticate for that, but totally fine. So the pull request command is again AB Azure boards pointing at number 1913. Peter made some changes. I'm going to create my pull request. It's reading out all the changes, no conflicts, all cool. And finally, if I go back to my boards and then refreshing, it's going to show me not just my pull request, that's what you see over here, but it's also keeping the merge operation from my pull request. Pretty cool stuff. That's the integration between Azure boards, work items, sprints, backlogs. Work item individual numbers are quite key here. And the action on the GitHub side just by integrating that marketplace Azure boards plugin. Awesome. Let's move on. Next integration option is Azure repos, where you got source control in Azure DevOps and maybe you want to migrate to GitHub repos, right? So what can you do here? Migrating Azure repos to GitHub is probably one of the easiest scenarios thinkable. Why? Because again, they rely on the Git source control standards. If you have source control in Azure DevOps, it already recognizes branches, pull requests, commit history, it's all in there. Cloning the repo again to GitHub will provide you the exact same benefits. And on top of that, it will keep track of all the historical changes. Next to that, GitHub, already mentioned, gives you that security integration out of the box, where for public repos, it is available for free. On the other side, for enterprise customers, it is part of your licensing as well. Another option is the Azure DevOps to GitHub repository migrator. There is a link that I'll show you later on in the demos, allowing you to migrate, literally running it as a migration tool. There's a couple of PowerShell scripts actually that they provide, allowing you to automate the migration so you don't have to go through the manual concepts yourself. And then once your repositories are out of Azure DevOps repos, moved into GitHub, I show you how to enable that security feature. And let's switch to another demo, nicely showing that integration and how to migrate. In this next demo, I'm going to show you how to migrate from Azure DevOps repos into GitHub repositories. So as you know, the Azure DevOps repos are Git enabled, Git compatible, which means it allows you full end-to-end source control, not just storing source code files, but also integrating everything we have over here from the commit messages, the branches, and if you want, even using tagging, pull requests, like the full swing that you also saw in some of my previous demos already. So it's not just about copying the source code, but it's also allowing us to migrate everything inside the repo. So what we can do is selecting the top of our repo and selecting clone. Out of the clone option, it's immediately providing this full end-to-end GitHub, Azure DevOps repository name. So it is the name of your organization at dev.azure.com, followed by the name of the organization, the name of the project, and eventually _git, which means it's going to read out the Git compatible version. And we click this little copy option here. Then we're switching to Azure, from Azure to our GitHub environment, where we're going to create a new repository. Now, instead of creating a new one from scratch and providing all the details, we select import repository up here. What it allows us to do is, you could probably guess, copying everything in here. So we're going to paste in our old repository URL. And we need to define the owner, if you're not the only one, and a target repository name, which can be the same as the one on Azure DevOps or something completely different, right? So let's reuse the same name, fast car case dev. That's the name of my project, so why not making it quite straightforward. And you can still define public, private. So it could be a public on Azure DevOps or private, and you could switch it over here. Cool. Begin import. How hard can it be? Detecting the version control. So technically meaning, are you using Git? And if so, what version? But next it's asking for credentials. Your old project requires credentials. It only needs read access. Okay, we can do that. We go back into Azure DevOps, and there's two technical options here. Or you create a personal access token using that one out of Azure DevOps to read back, or why not using the limited functionality, from a permissions perspective, to generate Git credentials. So what we can do here is providing Git credentials. You click on generate, it's giving you a username and credentials, which obviously I'm not going to show you. You provide credentials over here. Here is trying to kick in. And as you can see, the import process is already running. Are available. Nice one. We're moving on. The next part is how can we integrate and maybe migrate from Azure pipelines into our GitHub actions, right? So Azure pipelines, again, is that CI/CD scenario that everybody probably knows out of Azure DevOps, allowing you to run pipelines. Now GitHub Actions has workflows allowing you to run pipelines. So do we need to refactor everything? Not really, but on the other side, the migration is not that smooth. So in short, I see three possible scenarios. If you already use Azure pipelines in YAML, I would say migrate to YAML. And actually it sounds easier than it is, because what I already mentioned, it's YAML, but it's not the same YAML that they're relying on. So the syntax is different. A lot of the pipeline keywords are slightly different. So it's almost like starting all over. The other cool thing is that you can keep your Azure pipelines for now, but you could trigger them out of GitHub Actions. Got a cool demo on that. And then last, obviously, is starting over, where you need to rebuild your existing pipelines from Azure DevOps or any other DevOps tool and moving them into GitHub Actions workflow syntax. Zooming in a little bit on the syntax. So Azure Pipelines, first of all, supports that legacy classical editor, which lets you define your CI configuration in that GUI editor, instead of creating the pipeline from YAML. But YAML is also possible. GitHub Actions, on the other side, they only understand YAML. So you use YAML syntax to define workflows, and there's no graphical interface. Azure Pipelines allows you to integrate the structure into job definitions. So if you look here in the screenshot, and I'll walk you through another more detailed demo a little bit later on, you're going to see that there is an on syntax where the on keyword is not available in the Azure DevOps YAML syntax. We're going to use a slightly different scenario there. And the jobs are jobs, but the syntax is different. The scripts to run a script, like pulling up a bash script, a shell script, a PowerShell script, is also relying on different syntax. Integrating with the Azure DevOps build agents, like what are the virtual machines we're going to use to compile and run our pipelines, is now called runners in GitHub Actions, but they also use a different shell. So migrating from, for example, the command line, which is a default in Azure DevOps, into the shell on a Windows platform, where the script commands might be slightly different. Or looking at it from another perspective. So on the left-hand side here, we have our Azure pipelines. So one of the core basic snippets, I would say. So you have the steps where you're going to define steps, and within the steps you have a script where the script is relying on the bash language, right? So you could do script steps, but now in GitHub Workflows, it's steps and the run keyword. The default shell on Azure DevOps is the command, where the default shell on GitHub Actions will be PowerShell, at least if you're using the Windows platform as the build server or the runners. Then running a script is relying on the keyword script in Azure DevOps, but it's relying on the keyword run in workflows. And then jobs are integrating with dependencies, for example, where Azure Pipelines relies on the keyword depends on, and that one is needs as the keyword in the GitHub Actions workflow. And then specifically, or lastly, you could say the tasks within the different steps are also relying on slightly different syntax. So it's not that you could like reuse the YAML pipelines from Azure DevOps and easily migrating them into GitHub. I know there are a few attempts where there are some scripts available allowing you to migrate, to flip over the syntax, almost like a find replace, but trying it in some sort of automated way. But as far as I know, it's not. So in this next one, I'm going to show you how you can migrate your existing classic Azure DevOps pipelines into YAML syntax. And then later on, also showing a little bit what it could look like on the GitHub action side. So this is a build pipeline where I'm compiling a web application source code and integrating it into an artifact, where maybe later on, but I'm not going to show you as part of the demo, how you can reuse that artifact as the starting point for running a deployment, right? So it's a .NET based language. So what I did here is going into Azure DevOps and grabbing a web application pre-built pipeline from a template, where it's going to walk me through the different steps. I need to install a specific version of NuGet on my server because that's why my application source code expects. I'm going to trigger a NuGet restore. I'm going to run a build task and eventually copying some files and publishing them in an artifact drop web deploy package. This has been running fine for years. It's where maybe some of you started some time ago with Team Foundation Server, like the predecessor to Azure DevOps, like 5 years ago, and you still have the exact same pipeline. Where now you know it's about time to migrate into YAML syntax. So what we can do here is go into our pipeline scenario, creating a new pipeline, and this time over here, where we used to have the classic editor, we're gonna skip that for now, right? My repo is this DevOps environment one. I'm gonna grab my web application, and based on the content of the source code, it's gonna tell me like, oh, this could work fine. So I could integrate with some pre-built Docker templates, publishing to Kubernetes or traditional .NET. That's what I'm going for. What it's going to show me here is about the same as what it has in Classic, because technically it's based on the same template, right? So it's going to give me the definition of the pools, like running it against the Windows server and running task as part of a step. Task number 1, install NuGet. Next to that, run the NuGet restore, eventually vs build, maybe running some testing, but it's missing some steps. It's also missing some of the NuGet specific versioning. So what can we do here? There's two different options. We can click on this show assistant over here. That would be option 1. Where now I can search in all possible snippets we have from our classic interface. So here, if I search for NuGet, it's going to show me that exact same NuGet that we had in classic. Where now I can add the specific comments I want to run. So let's say I want to run NuGet restore against this specific project that I have. I can define some additional advanced settings, and the only thing I need to do here is adding it into my task list. So for this one, I need to make sure I'm over here in the correct location in my YAML file, adding it, and it's immediately pasting in the actual snippet. That's one option. The other option is if I go back to my classic pipeline from before, to compile web app, editing my pipeline. For each and every existing step in a classic pipeline, we show you the view YAML over here. What I can do is selecting this, or if I'm okay with everything in there, I go to copy clipboard, go back and replacing the task over here, and then fixing my indentation, and we're good to go. So it is really that easy to migrate from an existing or maybe a new classic pipeline into YAML syntax, copy pasting the little snippets that we provide you, or starting from scratch and still relying on that little classic assistant. If we want to do the same on the GitHub side, let's go into our project. We go into actions and let's search for a new workflow. So over here, since we already know it's a .NET based one, why not reusing the .NET that it's already offering here? Now, a couple of differences is obviously the syntax. As I mentioned, the syntax to trigger a pipeline, to trigger a pipeline in GitHub Actions is slightly different. So what it allows me to do here is triggering whenever, I'm gonna stop zooming. Looks like the recording doesn't really like that. So what we do here is providing a name for the pipeline, and it's using an on statement, where in Azure DevOps, the YAML syntax, if you paid attention, was trigger, right? Next, we have the jobs. That's about the same, where each and every job is a collection of tasks inside the steps. We're not really calling them tasks anymore. So there's like the high level syntax is about the same. We got steps, we got jobs, we got triggers, but again, the syntax is slightly different. On the other side, there's still the help instrument, you could say. So if I want to add a specific task into my steps, I can use this search filter on the side. So for example, doing something with artifacts, like upload a build artifact, where it's going to provide me some details, what I need to do, and I can grab this, moving it into my pipeline, pasting it in, and then again fixing the indentation, but that's just part of how the pipelines are working. So again, same philosophy, same concept, slightly different syntax. That would be mainly it, but not impossible to integrate, not impossible to migrate. That easy. Now, what I would recommend, and it's actually quite cool, is keep everything in Azure DevOps for now. And if you start integrating or migrating to GitHub Actions, why not moving to GitHub workflows, GitHub Action workflows, allowing you to actually trigger an Azure DevOps pipeline. What you need to do here is collecting or creating, first of all, an Azure DevOps personal access token, defining that as a secret in your GitHub secrets, making sure that it is obviously stored in a secured way. And from there, you're going to create a new GitHub Actions pipeline called the Azure Pipelines Action. So you can see here, it is relying on the uses. That's like, what action do I need to rely on? It's going to be a pre-built Azure/pipelines action definition. And you need to define two parameters. The DevOps URL, so that's literally the link to the homepage or the link to the pipeline page in Azure DevOps, defining the dev.azure.com, the base URL for Azure DevOps, the name of your organization and the name of your project, followed by the name of the pipeline, and also providing your DevOps token. And once you have that, you're gonna trigger your GitHub Actions pipeline. It's interacting with Azure DevOps and everything is still the same. And you could assume that there was a demo coming up for that. In this demo, I'm going to show you how to trigger Azure DevOps pipelines from within GitHub Actions. So in my example here, I'm going to use my Azure DevOps pipeline that I used before, the compile web app. It fits in the build stage, but if you want to do the same for releases, it's technically just changing a minor setting inside the GitHub Actions, so nothing too hard. From within my Azure DevOps environment, I'm switching to GitHub, and just for the fun of it, I created a quickly new project that I called ADO Pipeline Run. Inside the pipeline run, I have my GitHub workflows, the GitHub Actions if you want, and what I'm using there is an already pre-baked existing Azure Pipelines action. How do you know about it? You go into the marketplace, similar to my Azure boards, and you search for Azure pipelines. The tricky part here is there's two different scenarios. You have the apps called Azure Pipelines. That's going to allow you to interact with Azure Pipelines directly from within GitHub, but it's not what we're doing right now. What we're doing here is running the actual action called Azure Pipelines action. Similar to before, you can select it, you can copy it, and what you need is like this little snippet of code where it relies on the Azure DevOps project URL, the pipeline name, an Azure DevOps token, like a personal access token, and if you want, you can specify specific variables as well. Cool. One of the main issues, I would say, not really an issue, something you need to watch out for, is creating a token, right? So since we need to trigger the pipeline, we go into our user settings, personal access token, and we're going to create a new token. What you need to define here are the permissions for your Azure DevOps integration out of the GitHub Actions. In this case, since I'm only triggering a build, I'm going to select read and execute. If you want to do the same for releases or build and release together, you're going to flag the read, write, and execute as well. Or if you want to make it even more secure, you could split up the personal access tokens and providing two different ones depending on the action you want to run. Back to our GitHub environment where you go into the settings, secrets, actions, and you define an Azure DevOps token in which you paste in the outcome of the personal access token on the Azure DevOps side. Quite important that Azure_DevOps_token is like a hard-coded GitHub name, so make sure that you follow the correct syntax or it will not get recognized. And that's mainly it. So out of the actions, you can trigger the pipeline. Let me quickly show you what the actual pipeline looks like in YAML syntax. It's nothing too difficult. So we have a job called build because we're running a build pipeline, but this name could actually be something totally different. We're going to run it against an Ubuntu server because it's not doing a lot besides running or waking up Azure DevOps pipelines, right? The baseline job, Azure Pipelines as the action name, and specifying the DevOps project URL, the pipeline name, and the link to my secret called Azure DevOps token. That's it. To speed up the process a little bit, let's make a change in one of my source code files. Another update to trigger the actions. There we go. The reason why I need to update is because the on statement, like the trigger statement of my action, is only kicking in whenever there's a change in my source code. As you can see, within just a split second, it's already running my GitHub Actions pipeline. And checking in the details of my GitHub Actions pipeline, it's communicating with my Azure DevOps environment. So let me check back in my Azure DevOps environment, switching to my fast car project, switching to the pipelines, and the compiled web app is running. Nothing's changing. I'm reusing 100% everything that's in Azure DevOps. I'm just triggering it as part of a GitHub Actions pipeline, where now maybe, again, you could add additional steps inside the GitHub Actions pipeline, slightly migrating away from Azure DevOps, but as you hopefully figured out, there's no immediate need to do so. Cool. That's it for now. I mean, there's a lot more I could talk about, but it's not just my session, and there's so many more in the Azure Back to School that you could follow along. I know there's a few other sessions touching on other Azure DevOps capabilities, some of them touching on GitHub capabilities. So I would say hold on tight and keep following all the different sessions. I provided you quite some demos, a little bit of explanations, hopefully not too many because I like focusing on demos. primarily, but if you want to review some of the details, I provided you some links here with samples with more detailed explanations to follow along, to read through, and maybe repeating in your own environment. So that's it from my side. If you got any questions, once more, feel free to reach out, petender@microsoft.com on email, pdtit on Twitter, or the aka.ms pdtit if you want to follow along on my technical blog. I hope you enjoyed the session, first of all. I'll be back all the way at the end of the month with another session touching a little bit more on Azure, site reliability engineering, and showing you the awesome tool called Azure Chaos Studio. But for now, I'm going to close out. Thank you once more, Dwayne and Derek, for having me, and everybody here in the audience. Keep enjoying Azure Back to School. I hope you learn, I hope you enjoy, and hopefully see you again next year. Thank you so much, and have a nice day.